Did you know an underperforming employee that only earns $15 an hour could cost you as much as $60,000 to replace? What's worse, relative to their pay, the more money an employee makes, the greater the cost to replace them. In other words, a $100,000 employee could cost you as much as $500,000 if you needed to replace them. Well, obviously, you'd be better off rehabilitating an employee who's not working out versus replacing them. The challenge is that many business leaders, managers, supervisors, they shy away from having those difficult conversations. They don't know how to effectively rehabilitate. In fact, what they typically think about is disciplining. And that's the complete wrong approach. Now, I'm not saying there aren't disciplinary aspects to rehabilitation. I'm talking about what your mindset is. So what we want to talk about today is how do we approach those accountability conversations. Counseling sessions is actually how I prefer to think about them, so that you have the best chance of rehabilitating somebody instead of demotivating them. And it starts with your mindset. You know, as Dr. Stephen Covey, who said, start with the end in mind. If your goal is to make somebody feel good about themselves and feel that they're capable of doing better, then we have to start thinking about their success. If we think of this as a counseling session, where as a team, we are going to come up with a way for them to do better, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. If we think about it as discipline, we think about it as punishment, it makes it more negative. A counseling session puts you both on the same side, where the end result is supporting the team member as they get better. And nobody wants to do poorly at their job. So before you have these conversations, sit down and think about that. Think about, how do I care about them? I need to care about them, and I need to come to this from a place of love and caring. And once you've got the right mindset, now we have to have the right location. Since we care about their success, we need to make sure that they're set up so that they can hear the advice and counseling we're about to provide. We want to make sure they're open to receiving our input. That means it needs to be someplace private. There's an old saying, of course, praise in public, chastise in private. The reason for that is simple. We want to make sure people aren't embarrassed, they're not defensive, their ego doesn't get in the way. That in fact, they can be open, as I just mentioned, and hear what you have to say. Ideally, these are private conversations. Unfortunately, in the current litigious world we live in, that may not be a good idea. So you want to have a witness, but it should never be a peer to the person you're talking to or a coworker of any kind of theirs. Ideally, it's somebody from HR who can make sure you don't stray into trouble. But if that's not available because you either too small to have an HR department or for whatever other reason, one of your peers, a fellow manager or business partner, also would do well. In the absence of anyone along those lines, maybe an outside counselor, somebody from outside your organization, a trusted advisor who could come in and just be there as a witness to make sure that there are no claims against you that aren't true. The other thing is where you do this is really important. If you're going to have this conversation in your office or wherever it is you're going to have it, make sure that's not the only sort of evolution that goes on in there. If the only time you call somebody into your office is to have a counseling session with them, then people are going to be on their guard when they come in there. Right? It's a bit like your dog going to the vet. Every time they go to the vet, from their perspective, nothing good ever comes of it. No dog likes to go to the vet. No matter how much I love driving or going strange places and meeting strange people, the vet is never amongst them. You don't want your office to be the veterinarian's office. You don't want to be the principal's office, where the only time you got called down there was because you were in trouble. Now you had your location, your mindset. You have one more thing to do before you have this conversation. And that is to make a list of all the behaviors that are adding to the problem. In other words, Counseling sessions fall into one of two categories. They're either performance related, i.e., they're not meeting their numbers, right? Or their quality isn't there, something along those lines. Or they're personal behavioral problems. They're not getting along with coworkers, they're screaming and yelling, they're using inappropriate language, they're not following certain policies like they're on their cell phone during business times or surfing the web, using company, right? Things of that nature, where there's some sort of personal behavior that's not directly related to their production, but you need to have a conversation with them about. What's important is that we're going to talk about behaviors and not attitudes. And the distinction there is that a behavior is something you directly observe. You can see it, you can hear it, sometimes you could smell it. I've actually had to have conversations with people about their body odor. Right? That's a behavior. Now we can infer what's causing that, but you can't argue with somebody if they smell, if they show up late all the time, if they're not meeting their quota numbers, right? There's no argument there. But when you talk about attitudes, you're reading minds, and none of us are good at that. And it may be appearing that they have a bad attitude, but that's an inference we're drawing based on their behavior. So what are the specific behaviors that make you think they have a bad attitude? They're not smiling, they're not joking, they're not participating in meetings, they're being quiet. Those are all observable things. They're looking down, they got their arms crossed. If you talk about attitudes, you could be wrong. If you talk about behaviors, you may uncover something outside of work that you could help with that could be interfering with their ability to do the job because they're thinking about something else. So talk about behaviors and listen for what those root causes are. So make a list of all the behaviors that you've observed. Also, if it is a performance issue, make a list of the behaviors that perhaps they are not engaging in that are keeping them from meeting their numbers. This will be really, really useful once you start that conversation. So maybe they're not setting up their workstation correctly. I once had a service technician who would go to the clients and then take out what he needed from his truck as he needed it, instead of bringing everything he might need and a little extra into the site in one trip. This, of course, meant that his work orders took longer than they should have, and clients would complain about that. We'd end up having to give them a discount because they said he made 5 trips to the truck when one would have done. And of course, we didn't argue with that. So talk about behaviors like that. Once you have them written down, you're ready for the conversation. Bring the person into your office and start the conversation with where specifically they're deficient. In other words, don't start by building them up. There's a big tendency to do that. Oh, you're a really good worker, but. The problem is the word but negates everything that came before it. And in fact, people will view that as like, I don't trust what you're going to say because you just said I'm a good worker, but. So you really don't mean that. And if you don't mean that, what else don't you mean? The tendency to do that is because we want people to feel good about themselves. Unfortunately, what it usually does is has the opposite effect. Save your praise for a more appropriate time. If you feel you need to build them up, I invite you to consider substituting the word and for the word but. And is inclusive. You're a really good worker and you're frequently late. That tells somebody when they're here, they're good, and they're not always here on time, and that costs aggravation. So that's a negative, and those two can coexist together. It changes the dynamic completely. My suggestion, however, is to not include the positive with the negative. Make this only about the areas that you want to see improved, and think of it as an area that needs improvement, not an area that's already doing good. The A, after we start with where they're deficient, we want to then talk about what actions they need to take to improve. This is where your behavior list really comes into play, because now you can talk about the behaviors they're engaging in that are leading to their failures and talk about how they could change those behaviors to actually turn it into success. Maybe it's a salesperson who's not making enough cold calls, or it's a technician who is not setting up their workstation correctly. Whatever those behaviors are, that's the A. T, time frame to correct. I urge you to consider asking them how long it would take them to fully get up to speed, to meet the metrics that are required. Now, they're going to either tell you something that's way too long, way too short, or just right. But when you get them to say it, then you could at least have a conversation. If they said, oh, I'll have this fixed tomorrow, and you know it's going to take them a week or two, don't let them get away with that because they're setting themselves up for failure. On the other hand, they could say, well, it's going to take me a month. And you're thinking, no, I need this done in a week or 2 weeks at the most. Now you can negotiate with them. By making them part of the negotiation, they actually will own that and should, and most of the time will, meet those challenges. If it's a personal behavior issue, immediately is acceptable and in fact, in my estimation, required. You will never argue with somebody or scream at somebody, curse again, whatever that might be. The second A is what assistance is available. They can go for retraining, they can talk to counseling, they can come and talk to you, right? Check in with you on a daily basis to see how it's going. What assistance are you going to provide? And it's not just from you, within the company, within the organization, to ensure and help them be successful. When I say ensure, obviously there's nothing 100%, but give them every chance for success. This way they know you have their back. They know you're setting them up for success, not setting them up for failure. If you don't give them any assistance, you just want them to do better on their own, they're not going to do it. We know that because they didn't do it in the first place. So make sure you provide them assistance. And then the most important part of the conversation, what are the consequences of failure? This is where you're going to follow your progressive discipline policy, assuming you have one, but be specific here. This is not a time for you to use euphemisms. If the consequences are termination, you're going to be terminated. If the consequences are you're going to be demoted, you're going to lose pay, you're going to be transferred to another department, state it as bluntly and as plainly as possible. And the reason for this is simple. You don't want ambiguity. If you tell them exactly where they're deficient, what actions they need to do to correct it, the time frame they have to correct it in, you provide them the assistance and resources they need to fix it, and they still don't get it fixed, they're volunteering for those consequences. They are volunteering for those consequences, in which case, as long as you're a person of integrity and you know, and everybody knows that what you say is going to happen, then in fact they volunteered for those consequences and you follow through with them, and it's on them and it's not on you. Follow this simple formula and you'll find that you will rehabilitate more people than you ever had before, and you won't have to spend your time trying to replace them. I hope this helps.